Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Soviet Union. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1961, during the height of the Cold War space race, the Soviet Union achieved what the world believed to be their first manned spaceflight, with Yuri Gagarin's historic orbit around Earth on April 12th. What the world did not know, and what remained buried in classified archives for decades, was that Gagarin was not the first Soviet cosmonaut to leave Earth's atmosphere. 3 weeks earlier, on March 21st, 1961, a man known only in official documents as Cosmonaut 0 had already made that journey. He had flown beyond the prescribed orbital parameters, beyond the reach of Soviet ground control, and beyond the carefully constructed narrative of Soviet space supremacy. His name was systematically erased from every record, every photograph, every mention in official documentation. But erasure, as history has taught us, is never complete. The first trace of this hidden mission surfaced in 1964 when Dr. Elena Mikhailovna Volkov, a former technician at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, was found dead in her Moscow apartment. Among her personal effects, investigators discovered a collection of documents that should not have existed. Handwritten notes in her precise engineering script detailed pre-flight preparations for a mission designated only as Protocol 7. The papers described a launch window calculated for March 21st, 1961, weather conditions recorded as optimal, and a single line that would haunt investigators for years. Subject displays no emotional response to extended mission parameters. Psychological evaluation suspended per Directive 97A. Dr. Volkov's notes were confiscated immediately, but not before her neighbor, an elderly woman named Raisa Petrovna Kozlova, had glimpsed their contents. Years later, during a brief period of political openness in 1968, Raisa would tell investigators that Elena had spoken of a cosmonaut who went too far and could not find his way home. The old woman remembered Elena's words precisely because they had been spoken with such profound sadness, as if Elena carried personal responsibility for whatever had occurred. The apartment building where Elena Volkov lived stood in a quiet district of Moscow, constructed in the utilitarian style of post-war Soviet architecture. Grey concrete walls absorbed the limited sunlight that filtered through small, functional windows. The building's residents lived parallel lives, separated by thin walls, but bound by an unspoken agreement not to inquire too deeply into their neighbors' affairs. This cultural silence would prove crucial to understanding why Elena's death initially attracted so little attention. Elena had worked at Baikonur from 1958 through 1962, during the most critical period of Soviet space development. Her official position was listed as Environmental Systems Technician, responsible for monitoring and maintaining life support systems in spacecraft. Her colleagues described her as methodical, quiet, and utterly reliable. She arrived at work precisely at 7 each morning and departed at 6 each evening. She ate lunch alone, reading technical manuals while others socialized. She never spoke of her family, though records indicate she had grown up in a small village outside Leningrad that had been completely destroyed during the war. The psychological evaluation mentioned in Elena's notes referred to a process that had been implemented for all potential cosmonauts, designed to assess their mental stability under extreme stress conditions. Standard protocol required multiple sessions with trained psychologists, extensive interviews, and monitoring of subjects' responses to isolation and sensory deprivation. The notation about suspended evaluation suggested that something in Cosmonaut 0's psychological profile had caused concern among the medical team. yet the mission had proceeded regardless. In 1965, during renovations of a storage facility at Baikonur, workers discovered a sealed container that had been incorrectly catalogued and forgotten. Inside were photographic negatives showing pre-flight preparations for what appeared to be an undocumented mission. The images showed a figure in a spacesuit, but the face was obscured by the helmet's reflective visor. More significantly, the suit bore no identifying markings, no name patch, no mission designation. In every official Soviet space mission, cosmonaut suits were clearly marked with their names and mission numbers. This suit was completely anonymous. The facility where these photographs were found had been used for storing sensitive materials related to early space missions. Workers described the building as perpetually cold, even in summer, with a persistent smell of chemicals and metal. The container holding the photographs had been placed behind stacks of decommissioned equipment in a section of the facility that was rarely accessed. The discovery was reported to facility management, who immediately contacted Moscow. Within hours, military personnel arrived to secure the site. The workers who had found the container were transferred to other assignments within the week. One of these workers, Dmitry Sergeyevich Orlov, later told his wife about the photographs before his transfer. He described them as showing launch preparations that seemed somehow different from the routine he had observed during official missions. The technicians in the photographs appeared tense, their movements careful and deliberate in a way that suggested unusual circumstances. Most disturbing to Dmitry was what he described as the complete absence of the celebratory atmosphere that typically preceded Soviet space missions. There were no smiling faces, no congratulatory gestures, no signs of the pride and excitement that usually accompanied such historic moments. The question of Cosmonaut Zero's identity became the focus of unofficial investigations conducted by several individuals within the Soviet space program. These investigations were necessarily discreet, conducted through conversations in hallways, casual questions posed during routine meetings, and careful examination of personnel records that might contain inconsistencies. What emerged was a pattern of omissions and gaps in documentation that suggested deliberate concealment. Personnel records from Baikonur for the period between January and April 1961 showed several anomalies. 3 candidates who had been selected for cosmonaut training in late 1960 were no longer listed among active personnel by May 1961. Official explanations varied. One had been medically disqualified, another had requested transfer to a different program, and the third had experienced a family emergency requiring extended leave. These explanations might have seemed routine, if not for the fact that no subsequent records could be found documenting any of these individuals returning to any position within the Soviet space program or related agencies. The medical facility at Baikonur maintained detailed health records for all cosmonauts, including psychological evaluations, physical fitness assessments, and ongoing monitoring reports. In 1966, a routine audit of these records revealed that several files from early 1961 were missing. The missing files corresponded to the time period when Elena Volkov's notes indicated that Protocol 7 preparations had taken place. Medical staff who had worked during that period reported that they could not recall specific details about the missing files, though several mentioned that there had been unusual security protocols in place during certain evaluations. Dr. Anatoly Fedorovich Petrov, who served as chief medical officer at Baikonur from 1959 through 1963, was interviewed in 1967 regarding the missing medical records. Dr. Petrov, by then retired and living in a small apartment in Kiev, spoke carefully about his years at the space facility. He confirmed that there had been periods when access to medical files was restricted, when certain evaluations were conducted under enhanced security measures, and when medical staff were required to sign additional confidentiality agreements beyond their standard oaths. During this interview, Dr. Petrov made a statement that would later prove significant. He mentioned that there had been one cosmonaut candidate who had presented what he termed unusual psychological characteristics. This individual had demonstrated exceptional technical competence and physical conditioning, but psychological evaluations had revealed what Dr. Petrov described as an absence of normal fear responses and an unusual degree of detachment from emotional stimuli. Standard protocol would have disqualified such a candidate, but Dr. Petrov indicated that he had been instructed to continue medical clearance procedures despite his professional reservations. The apartment where Dr. Petrov lived in Kiev occupied the third floor of a building that had been constructed during the 1930s. The walls were thick, the windows small, and the hallways dimly lit by infrequent overhead bulbs. Dr. Petrov's apartment consisted of 2 rooms, a combined living and sleeping area, and a small kitchen. The rooms were sparsely furnished but meticulously clean. Books on medical topics filled shelves constructed from boards and concrete blocks. The apartment's most notable feature was its complete silence. No sound from neighboring apartments penetrated the thick walls, and Dr. Petrov himself spoke in barely audible whispers, as if afraid that his words might be overheard. The question of what had actually occurred during Protocol 7 remained unanswered until 1968, when restoration work at a Moscow library uncovered a collection of personal journals that had been donated anonymously in 1963. Among these journals was one belonging to Viktor Alexandrovich Kozlov, identified in library records as a communications engineer who had worked at various Soviet space facilities. The journal covered the period from January through June 1961 and contained entries that provided the first detailed account of what had transpired during the mysterious mission. Victor's journal entries were written in a careful, methodical hand, with dates and times precisely recorded. The entries from March 1961 described his assignment to a special communications team responsible for maintaining contact with an undocumented mission. The team had been assembled from personnel drawn from different departments, individuals who did not normally work together and who were instructed not to discuss their assignment with anyone outside the team. Victor's role was to monitor radio communications and maintain continuous contact with the spacecraft during its mission. According to Victor's journal, radio contact with the spacecraft was established successfully during launch and remained clear during the initial orbital phase. The cosmonaut's voice was described as calm and professional, reporting system status and mission parameters according to standard protocols. However, approximately 6 hours into the mission, communication patterns began to change. The cosmonaut's responses to ground control became increasingly delayed, and his voice took on what Victor described as a strange quality, as if he were speaking from a great distance, though signal strength remained constant. The journal entries became increasingly detailed as Victor documented the mission's progression. 8 hours after launch, the cosmonaut stopped responding to direct questions from ground control. He continued to transmit, but his communications consisted primarily of technical readings and observations that were not requested by mission controllers. Victor noted that these unsolicited communications described phenomena that did not correspond to known orbital characteristics or expected mission parameters. By the 10th hour of the mission, ground control had lost the ability to influence the spacecraft's trajectory or systems. The cosmonaut was no longer acknowledging instructions and appeared to be operating according to his own decisions. Victor's journal entries from this period reflected the growing anxiety among the communications team as they realized they were monitoring a mission that was no longer under official control. The Cosmonaut continued to transmit regularly, but his communications had become increasingly disconnected from Earth-based reality. Victor documented conversations he overheard between senior mission controllers and officials from Moscow who had been summoned to address the situation. These conversations, conducted in urgent whispers in corridors adjacent to the communications center, revealed that the mission had deviated far beyond its planned parameters. The spacecraft was no longer following its prescribed orbital path, and the cosmonaut was making decisions that suggested he had no intention of returning to Earth according to the established mission profile. The final communication documented in Victor's journal occurred 22 hours after launch. The cosmonaut's transmission consisted of a brief technical report, followed by a statement that Victor recorded precisely. Ground control, this is Cosmonaut 0. Mission parameters have been exceeded. I am proceeding according to personal assessment. Do not attempt recovery. End transmission. After this communication, all contact with the spacecraft ceased permanently. Victor's journal entries for the days following the mission described a communications facility that had become strangely quiet. The special team was dissolved immediately, and its members were reassigned to different projects. Victor himself was transferred to a routine monitoring position that required no security clearance. The communications equipment that had been used for Protocol 7 was removed from the facility within 48 hours, and Victor was instructed to submit all documentation related to the mission for secure storage. The journal also contained Victor's personal observations about the psychological atmosphere at the facility during and after the mission. He described colleagues who had become withdrawn and uncommunicative, as if they had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of their work and its purpose. Routine tasks continued normally, but Victor noted that conversations among staff members had become stilted and careful, as if everyone was afraid of accidentally referencing events that were not supposed to be discussed. In the weeks following Protocol 7, Victor documented several incidents that suggested ongoing concern among facility management about potential security breaches. Staff members were subjected to additional interviews with security personnel, focusing on their knowledge of the undocumented mission and their understanding of confidentiality requirements. Victor noted that these interviews were conducted with unusual intensity, and that several staff members who had been present during the mission were subsequently transferred to remote assignments. The library where Victor's journal was discovered occupied a building in central Moscow that had served various administrative functions since its construction in the early 1900s. The building's reading rooms featured high ceilings, tall windows, and rows of wooden tables that had been polished smooth by decades of use. The basement storage areas, where the donated journals had been placed, were considerably less appealing. Low ceilings, minimal lighting, and air that carried the persistent smell of aging paper and binding materials. Librarians who processed Victor's journal in 1963 remembered it primarily because of its technical content, which seemed unusual for personal writing. The journal had been donated along with approximately 50 other personal journals and diaries by someone who provided no name and left no contact information. Library staff assumed it was part of an estate donation, possibly from family members who wanted to preserve the writings but did not wish to maintain them personally. The restoration work that led to the journal's rediscovery in 1968 was part of a broader effort to preserve historical documents that were deteriorating due to poor storage conditions. Workers tasked with this restoration described the basement storage areas as particularly challenging environments. Temperature and humidity fluctuated significantly, and many documents showed signs of damage from moisture and insects. Victor's journal had been better preserved than most, possibly because its binding materials had resisted environmental damage more effectively than other items in the collection. Investigation into Victor Kozlov's background revealed limited information about his personal life and career after 1961. Personnel records indicated that he had continued working in communications roles at various Soviet facilities through 1964, when he had requested medical retirement due to what official documents described as stress-related health complications. No records could be found documenting his activities or whereabouts after 1964. The question of what had actually happened to Cosmonaut Zero remained unanswered until 1969, when a former tracking station operator named Sergei Dmitrievich Volkov came forward with information that provided crucial details about the mission's ultimate outcome. Sergei had worked at a remote tracking facility in Siberia that monitored spacecraft trajectories and maintained communication capabilities for missions that traveled beyond standard orbital parameters. Sergei's account, documented in a statement he provided to researchers in 1969, described his involvement in tracking an unscheduled spacecraft that had appeared on monitoring equipment during late March 1961. The spacecraft was traveling at velocities and following trajectories that were inconsistent with any known Soviet mission profiles. Initial attempts to establish communication had failed, but passive monitoring revealed that the spacecraft was indeed occupied and that its occupant was making regular transmissions. According to Sergei's statement, the tracking facility had monitored the spacecraft for approximately 6 days, during which time it traveled far beyond Earth's gravitational influence and into deep space. The spacecraft's trajectory indicated that it was not following any orbital pattern and appeared to be proceeding in a straight line away from Earth at continuously increasing velocity. Monitoring equipment tracked the spacecraft until its signals became too weak to detect, a process that took nearly a week of continuous observation. The tracking facility where Sergei worked was located in a region of Siberia characterized by extreme cold and geographic isolation. The nearest population center was more than 200 kilometers away, accessible only by aircraft during most of the year. The facility itself consisted of several buildings constructed to withstand severe weather, connected by enclosed walkways that allowed personnel to move between areas without exposure to the harsh external environment. Living quarters were functional but comfortable, designed to accommodate staff members who might be stationed at the facility for months at a time. Sergei described the facility's routine as highly regimented but generally predictable. Staff worked in shifts to maintain continuous monitoring capabilities, with clear protocols for documenting and reporting any unusual observations. The appearance of the unscheduled spacecraft had disrupted this routine significantly, requiring continuous monitoring by multiple personnel and direct communication with authorities in Moscow, who provided specific instructions for handling the situation. The psychological impact of monitoring Cosmonaut Zero's spacecraft affected the facility's staff in ways that Sergei documented carefully in his statement. Personnel who participated in the extended monitoring reported difficulty sleeping and eating during the period when they were tracking the spacecraft's journey into deep space. Several staff members requested reassignment immediately after the spacecraft disappeared from monitoring range, citing personal reasons that they declined to specify. Sergei's own experience during the monitoring period reflected the broader impact on facility personnel. He described feeling increasingly uncomfortable as each day passed and the spacecraft continued moving away from Earth. The realization that they were monitoring a human being traveling alone into deep space, with no possibility of return and no apparent mission objective beyond continued travel, created what Sergei termed an atmosphere of profound unease among everyone involved in the tracking effort. The final communication transmitted by Cosmonaut 0 and detected by the Siberian facility occurred 6 days after the spacecraft had first appeared on tracking equipment. The transmission was brief and consisted primarily of technical data about spacecraft systems and the cosmonaut's physical condition. However, the transmission concluded with a personal message that Sergei transcribed precisely. To whoever may monitor these transmissions, I have fulfilled the mission according to my understanding of its true purpose. The silence of space is more honest than the noise of Earth. I continue as planned. After this final transmission, all signals from the spacecraft ceased permanently. Monitoring equipment continued operating for several additional days, but no further communications or tracking signatures were detected. The spacecraft and its occupant had essentially vanished into the vast emptiness of space, leaving behind only the documentation created by personnel who had witnessed this unprecedented departure from established mission protocols. The tracking facility received instructions from Moscow to discontinue all monitoring related to the unscheduled spacecraft and to submit all documentation for secure storage. Staff members were required to sign additional confidentiality agreements and were subsequently reassigned to different facilities. The tracking station itself was decommissioned 6 months later, with equipment being transferred to other installations and the facility being abandoned. Sergei's statement, provided in 1969, represented the first comprehensive account of Cosmonaut 0's final communications and ultimate fate. However, questions remained about the cosmonaut's identity, his selection for this unusual mission, and the decision-making process that had led to Protocol 7's implementation, despite apparent violations of standard safety protocols. Research into historical records from the period between 1958 and 1962 revealed additional information about the broader context surrounding Cosmonaut 0's mission. During this period, the Soviet space program was under intense pressure to achieve significant milestones before their American counterparts, leading to acceleration of development timelines and, in some cases, acceptance of higher risk levels than would normally be considered appropriate. Internal documents from this period, discovered during archive reorganization in 1967, indicated that there had been ongoing discussions among Soviet space program leadership about the potential value of missions that extended beyond Earth's immediate orbital environment. These discussions reflected both scientific interest in deep space exploration and strategic consideration of potential military applications for spacecraft capable of traveling to extreme distances. The document suggested that Protocol 7 had been developed as a test of both spacecraft capabilities and human psychological endurance under extreme isolation conditions. The mission's parameters appear to have been designed to determine whether a human being could maintain functionality during extended solitary travel in deep space, information that would be valuable for future missions involving travel to other planets or strategic positioning of assets beyond Earth's gravitational influence. However, the documents also indicated significant disagreement among program leadership about the ethical implications of such a mission. Medical personnel had raised concerns about subjecting a human being to psychological conditions that were unprecedented and potentially irreversible. Engineering staff had questioned whether spacecraft systems could maintain functionality during extended deep space travel without ground support or external intervention capabilities. The selection criteria for Cosmonaut 0 appeared to have been developed specifically to identify an individual who could psychologically endure the mission's extreme isolation requirements. Standard cosmonaut selection emphasized psychological stability, emotional resilience, and strong motivation to return safely to Earth. The criteria for Protocol 7, by contrast, seemed to prioritize emotional detachment, reduced social connections, and what documents described as philosophical acceptance of mission outcomes regardless of personal survival. Background research conducted on individuals who met these selection criteria revealed a pattern of personal histories characterized by significant loss and isolation. Candidates had typically experienced the death of family members during the war, extended periods of social isolation during their formative years, and career paths that involved minimal interpersonal relationships. These background factors appeared to have been considered advantages rather than concerns for the specific requirements of Protocol 7. The psychological evaluation process for Protocol 7 was documented in reports that were discovered in 1968 during renovation of a medical facility formerly associated with the Soviet space program. These reports described evaluation methods that were significantly different from standard procedures, focusing on candidates' responses to scenarios involving permanent separation from Earth and acceptance of mission objectives that prioritized scientific data collection over personal survival. One evaluation report, dated February 1961, described a candidate who demonstrated what evaluators termed exceptional suitability for Protocol 7 requirements. The candidate showed no emotional distress when presented with mission scenarios involving permanent departure from Earth, expressed no concern about inability to maintain contact with terrestrial relationships, and demonstrated consistent focus on technical mission objectives regardless of personal consequences. The report concluded with a recommendation for immediate mission assignment. The medical facility where these evaluation reports were discovered had been closed in 1965 and subsequently used for storage of materials related to discontinued programs. The building occupied a site that had previously housed a research institute focused on human psychology under extreme conditions. During the war, the facility had been used to study the psychological effects of prolonged isolation and deprivation on military personnel, research that provided background knowledge for later space program applications. Workers who discovered the evaluation reports during building renovation described the storage areas as containing numerous documents related to psychological research conducted during the 1950s and early 1960s. Many documents showed signs of deliberate damage, as if someone had attempted to destroy them but had been interrupted before completing the task. The Protocol 7 evaluation reports were among the few documents that remained completely intact and legible. The question of whether Cosmonaut 0 had volunteered for his mission or had been assigned without full knowledge of its parameters remained unresolved until 1969, when a letter was discovered among the personal effects of Dr. Elena Volkov's landlord, who had died intestate several years earlier. The letter, written in Elena's handwriting and dated March 19, 1961, was addressed to her sister, but apparently never sent. Elena's letter described her involvement in final preparations for Protocol 7 and her growing concern about the mission's ethical implications. She wrote about conversations with the selected cosmonaut, whom she identified only as Subject 7, describing him as someone who seemed to understand the mission's true nature and had explicitly requested assignment to it despite being fully informed about the expected outcome. According to Elena's letter, Subject 7 had approached space program administrators with a specific request to be considered for any missions involving travel beyond Earth's orbital environment. He had argued that conventional missions, with their emphasis on safe return to Earth, were limiting the Soviet Union's space exploration capabilities, and that meaningful advances required willingness to accept missions with different risk profiles and objectives. Elena described Subject 7 as someone who appeared to have no significant personal relationships on Earth and who expressed the view that his life would be more meaningful if dedicated to advancing human knowledge of space rather than maintaining conventional terrestrial existence. The letter indicated that Subject 7 had specifically requested assignment to missions that would contribute maximum scientific value regardless of personal survival probability. The letter also revealed Elena's personal struggle with her role in preparing Subject 7 for his mission. She described him as intelligent, technically competent, and completely at peace with the mission's implications. But she questioned whether the space program had the right to accept a volunteer for a mission that would certainly result in permanent separation from Earth and probable death in deep space. Elena's final entries in the letter expressed her decision to document Protocol 7's preparations and outcomes as completely as possible, believing that future evaluation of the mission's ethical implications would require comprehensive historical records. She indicated her intention to preserve these records in a secure location where they could be accessed by future researchers who might be in a position to assess whether such missions represented acceptable advancement of human knowledge or unconscionable exploitation of individual volunteers. The building where Elena's letter was discovered had served as a residence for space program personnel and their families during the 1950s and early 1960s. Apartments were assigned based on security clearance levels and job responsibilities, creating a community of individuals who were all connected to the Soviet space program, but who were required to maintain strict confidentiality about their specific work activities. Residents of the building described a social environment characterized by friendly, superficial relationships, but carefully maintained boundaries regarding professional topics. Children played together in shared courtyard areas, families attended communal celebrations during holidays, and neighbors provided mutual assistance during personal difficulties. However, conversations about work were limited to general topics, and residents understood that detailed discussions about specific projects or assignments were not appropriate within the community. The discovery of Elena's letter in 1969 prompted additional investigation into the personal histories of individuals who had been involved in Protocol 7. This research was conducted discreetly by historians and journalists who had become interested in documenting previously unknown aspects of early Soviet space missions. Their investigations revealed a pattern of premature deaths, sudden relocations, and career changes among personnel who had been associated with the mission. Of the 12 individuals identified as having direct involvement in Protocol 7's planning and implementation, 6 had died by 1967 under circumstances that were officially attributed to natural causes or accidents. 3 had relocated to remote positions where they had minimal contact with other space program personnel. 2 had requested early retirement from the space program and had subsequently avoided any public discussion of their former work. Only 1, Viktor Kozlov, had attempted to document his experiences before disappearing from official records in 1964. This pattern suggested that Protocol 7's aftermath had involved systematic efforts to eliminate potential sources of information about the mission. Whether this had been accomplished through deliberate intervention or through the psychological pressure experienced by individuals who had participated in ethically questionable activities could not be determined from available evidence. The final piece of documented evidence related to Cosmonaut 0 emerged in 1969 when a former security officer named Alexei Georgievich Fedorov provided a statement to researchers investigating Soviet space program history. Alexei had been responsible for maintaining security protocols at Baikonur during the 1961 period and had direct knowledge of measures taken to ensure confidentiality regarding Protocol 7. According to Alexei's statement, security protocols for Protocol 7 had been unprecedented in their comprehensiveness and severity. All personnel with any knowledge of the mission had been subjected to continuous monitoring. Their communications had been intercepted and reviewed, and their personal relationships had been investigated to identify potential security risks. These measures had continued for several years after the mission's completion. Alexei described the implementation of these security measures as having a profound impact on facility morale and working relationships. Personnel became increasingly cautious about all forms of communication, both professional and personal. Social interactions among staff members became stilted and superficial as individuals became concerned that casual conversations might be misinterpreted as security violations. The security protocols had also included provisions for responding to any potential public disclosure of information about Protocol 7. Plans had been developed for discrediting any individual who might attempt to discuss the mission publicly, including character assassination, professional destruction, and, if necessary, more direct forms of intervention to ensure continued confidentiality. Alexei's statement indicated that these security measures had been developed based on the assumption that Protocol 7 represented only the first of several similar missions that would be implemented as the Soviet space program expanded its deep space exploration capabilities. The extraordinary secrecy was intended to protect a long-term program rather than simply concealing a single mission that had exceeded its planned parameters. However, according to Alexei's information, no additional missions similar to Protocol 7 had been implemented after 1961. The decision to discontinue such missions appeared to have been based on recognition that the psychological and ethical costs were too severe to justify continuation, regardless of potential scientific or strategic benefits. The facility where Alexei had worked maintained security archives that contained detailed records of all protocols implemented to protect classified information. However, Alexei indicated that records related to Protocol 7 had been removed from these archives in 1965 and had presumably been destroyed or transferred to higher security locations where access would be impossible for normal research purposes. Alexei's personal experience implementing security measures for Protocol 7 had convinced him that the mission represented a fundamental violation of principles that should govern human space exploration. His decision to provide information to researchers in 1969 reflected his belief that historical documentation of such missions was necessary to prevent similar decisions in the future. The statement Alexei provided included his assessment that Cosmonaut 0 had been selected and trained for a mission that exploited his psychological vulnerabilities rather than utilizing his strengths for legitimate exploration purposes. In Alexei's view, the mission had been designed to satisfy institutional curiosity about human psychological limits rather than to advance scientific understanding or strategic capabilities that would benefit the Soviet Union. By 1969, when the last documented evidence related to Protocol 7 emerged, a comprehensive picture had developed of a mission that had been planned and implemented outside normal oversight mechanisms, utilizing selection criteria designed to identify a volunteer who could psychologically accept permanent departure from Earth, and supported by security measures intended to ensure that no information about the mission would become public knowledge. The evidence suggested that Cosmonaut 0 had indeed volunteered for his mission, with full knowledge of its implications, that he had been selected based on psychological characteristics that made him uniquely suitable for extreme isolation, and that he had successfully completed his mission according to his own understanding of its objectives rather than according to ground control instructions. However, the broader institutional context surrounding Protocol 7 raised questions about the ethical framework that had permitted such a mission to be approved and implemented. The evidence indicated that space program leadership had been willing to accept a volunteer for a mission that would certainly result in permanent loss of human life, in exchange for information about spacecraft capabilities and human psychological endurance under unprecedented conditions. The long-term impact of Protocol 7 on individuals who had been involved in its planning and implementation demonstrated the psychological cost of participating in activities that violated normal ethical boundaries, even when such activities were officially sanctioned and served stated institutional objectives. The systematic elimination of evidence related to Protocol 7, including the premature deaths and sudden relocations of involved personnel, suggested that institutional recognition of the mission's ethical problems had led to efforts to erase its history rather than to learn from it for future decision-making purposes. The story of Cosmonaut Zero thus represented more than simply an account of an individual who had traveled further from Earth than any human being before or since. It documented an institutional willingness to exploit individual psychological vulnerabilities for experimental purposes, and the subsequent efforts to conceal this exploitation when its ethical implications became apparent. The silence that surrounded Protocol 7 for nearly a decade after its implementation reflected not only official security concerns, but also the personal psychological burden carried by individuals who had participated in or witnessed activities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the value of human life and the limits of acceptable risk in pursuit of scientific advancement. Years passed without any additional discoveries related to Cosmonaut Zero or Protocol 7. The individuals who had provided information to researchers either died or relocated to places where they could not be contacted for follow-up investigations. Archives that might have contained additional documentation remained classified or were reported to have been destroyed during routine facility updates. The remote tracking station in Siberia, where Cosmonaut Zero's final transmissions had been monitored, was demolished in 1970, with the official explanation that the facility was no longer needed for current space program operations. Workers involved in the demolition reported that all equipment had been removed before their arrival, and that the buildings had been thoroughly cleaned of any materials that might have provided evidence of their former use. The apartment building in Moscow, where Dr. Elena Volkov had lived, was renovated in 1971, with individual apartments being completely redesigned and all original fixtures being replaced. During this renovation, no additional documents or materials related to Elena's work were discovered, despite careful examination of areas where items might have been concealed. The medical facility where Protocol 7 psychological evaluations had been conducted was converted to other uses in 1972 and subsequently underwent several ownership changes that resulted in complete removal of any materials related to its former psychological research activities. The building eventually became a textile manufacturing facility, with no remaining physical evidence of its connection to space program activities. The library, where Viktor Kozlov's journal had been discovered, implemented new policies in 1973, requiring detailed documentation of all materials donated to its collections. However, no additional journals or documents related to Soviet space program activities were donated after these policies were implemented, suggesting that any remaining materials were either destroyed or transferred to other locations. By 1975, active research into Protocol 7 had essentially ceased due to lack of available evidence and absence of individuals willing or able to provide additional information. The mission's existence remained documented only in the materials that had been discovered during the brief period between 1964 and 1969, when various individuals had been willing to share their knowledge with researchers. The question of what had ultimately become of Cosmonaut Zero remained unanswered. His spacecraft had last been detected traveling at high velocity away from Earth's solar system, following a trajectory that would carry it into deep space without possibility of return. Whether the cosmonaut had survived the extended journey, whether spacecraft systems had continued functioning in the extreme environment of deep space, and whether any record existed of his final experiences, could not be determined from available evidence. The mission's legacy existed primarily in the psychological impact it had created among space program personnel who had been aware of its implementation. These individuals had been forced to confront fundamental questions about the limits of acceptable human experimentation and the responsibility of institutions to protect individual welfare, even when individuals volunteered for potentially harmful activities. The systematic concealment of Protocol 7's existence had also established precedents for institutional secrecy that extended beyond legitimate national security concerns to include concealment of activities that might generate ethical criticism or legal liability. This precedent would influence space program decision-making and documentation practices for years after the mission itself had been completed. The story of Cosmonaut Zero demonstrated the potential for technological capabilities to develop more rapidly than ethical frameworks for governing their use. The Soviet space program's ability to design and implement missions involving travel to extreme distances had exceeded institutional wisdom about appropriate limits on human experimentation and individual risk acceptance. Perhaps most significantly, Protocol 7 illustrated the psychological vulnerability of individuals who had experienced severe personal loss and social isolation. Cosmonaut Zero's willingness to volunteer for a mission involving permanent departure from Earth reflected psychological damage that made him susceptible to institutional exploitation despite his technical competence and apparent rational decision-making. The silence that eventually surrounded Protocol 7 became complete and permanent. By 1980, even researchers who had documented the mission's existence during the 1960s found that their notes and interviews were regarded with skepticism by colleagues who preferred to focus on officially acknowledged space program achievements rather than exploring potentially embarrassing historical episodes. The individuals who had provided evidence about Protocol 7 were remembered, when they were remembered at all, as people who had become psychologically damaged by their involvement in space program activities and whose accounts therefore could not be considered reliable historical documentation. This interpretation allowed institutional memory to acknowledge their contributions to space program development while dismissing their claims about activities that had violated normal ethical boundaries. The building in Moscow, where researchers had conducted interviews with former space program personnel, was purchased by a private organization in 1982 and converted to office space for commercial activities. During this conversion, all materials related to space program research were removed and reportedly destroyed as no longer having historical value. The remote regions of Siberia, where tracking stations had monitored deep space communications, gradually returned to their natural state as the harsh climate reclaimed facilities that were no longer maintained. Local residents, few as they were in such remote areas, occasionally reported finding debris from abandoned installations, but investigation of such reports was discontinued when it became apparent that no materials of historical significance were being recovered. The official history of Soviet space program achievements, as documented in publications released during the 1980s and 1990s, made no reference to missions that had occurred prior to Yuri Gagarin's successful orbital flight in April 1961. According to these official histories, Gagarin represented the first successful human space mission, and all subsequent Soviet space achievements built upon the foundation established by his historic achievement. The erasure of Cosmonaut 0 from official records became so complete that by the 1990s, even former space program personnel who had worked during the relevant period expressed genuine uncertainty about whether Protocol 7 had actually occurred or whether it represented a collective psychological phenomenon created by the stress and secrecy that characterized early space program operations. This uncertainty was reinforced by the absence of any physical evidence that could definitively prove the mission's existence. No spacecraft components, no official documentation, no photographic evidence remained accessible to researchers or historians who might have been interested in documenting previously unknown aspects of Soviet space program history. The psychological impact of this systematic erasure extended beyond the individuals who had been directly involved in Protocol 7. Space program personnel who joined the organization during later periods absorbed an institutional culture that discouraged curiosity about activities that were not officially acknowledged, creating a self-perpetuating system of selective historical memory. The question of whether similar missions had been conducted by other space programs remained unanswered, as researchers lacked access to classified materials that might have documented comparable activities. However, the precedent established by Protocol 7 suggested that technological capabilities might have been tested in ways that exceeded publicly acknowledged parameters in various national space programs during the competitive period of the 1960s. The broader implications of Cosmonaut Zero's story extended beyond space program history to raise fundamental questions about institutional responsibility for protecting individuals who volunteer for high-risk activities. The mission demonstrated how institutional objectives could override individual welfare considerations when volunteers were willing to accept extreme risks for stated scientific or strategic purposes. The ethical framework that had permitted Protocol 7's implementation reflected institutional assumptions about acceptable human experimentation that were later recognized as problematic in various fields of scientific research. The mission occurred during a period when formal oversight mechanisms for protecting human subjects were less developed, allowing institutional decision-makers greater discretion in determining appropriate risk levels for volunteers. By the year 2000, when the Soviet Union no longer existed and Russian space program operations had been reorganized under different institutional structures, occasional references to Protocol 7 emerged in historical discussions among former space program personnel. However, these references were typically dismissed as unreliable memories influenced by decades of speculation and rumor rather than accurate recollections of actual events. The remote possibility that Cosmonaut 0 might still be traveling through deep space decades after his departure from Earth generated occasional scientific speculation about the survival limits of human beings in extreme isolation conditions. However, such speculation was necessarily theoretical due to the absence of any means for detecting or communicating with spacecraft that had traveled beyond the range of Earth-based monitoring systems. The final documented reference to Protocol 7 appeared in a private letter written in 2003 by Dr. Mikhail Petrov, the son of Dr. Anatoly Fedorovich Petrov, who had served as chief medical officer at Baikonur during the early 1960s. The letter was addressed to a space history researcher and contained Dr. Mikhail Petrov's recollections of conversations with his father during the 1970s, when the elder Dr. Petrov had spoken about ethical dilemmas he had faced during his space program career. According to this letter, Dr. Anatoly Petrov had told his son about a cosmonaut candidate who had been selected for a mission despite psychological evaluation results that should have disqualified him from any space assignment. The elder Dr. Petrov had described this situation as the most difficult ethical challenge of his professional career, as he had been required to provide medical clearance for a mission that he believed would result in the volunteer's death. The letter indicated that Dr. Anatoly Petrov had carried profound guilt about this decision throughout the remainder of his life, believing that his professional responsibility should have been to protect the candidate's welfare, rather than to facilitate institutional objectives that exploited the candidate's psychological vulnerabilities. Dr. Mikhail Petrov's letter was the last documented evidence related to Protocol 7 to emerge from individuals who had personal connections to space program personnel from the relevant period. After 2003, no additional materials or testimonies were discovered that provided information about Cosmonaut Zero or his mission. The silence became absolute. In the vast darkness between stars, somewhere beyond human reach or human knowledge, the question of what became of Cosmonaut Zero remains unanswered. His journey continues, as it has for decades, carrying with it the unresolved ethical questions that his mission represented and the institutional secrets that were buried with those who sent him into that endless night. The archives are closed, the witnesses are gone. The truth travels alone through space, as silent and unreachable as the cosmonaut who carried it there. And perhaps some stories are meant to remain unfinished, suspended forever between Earth and the infinite darkness that lies beyond human understanding.